Right, welcome to the first Catholic Concern for Animals YouTube event, and we are very pleased today to have with us David Clough from CEFAW, and CEFAW have just launched their framework on farmed animals. We're going to talk today about that framework and David's work with respect to fish and respect to fish farming, and also in wider context as well. So let me kick off, David, by saying you've just launched the framework, which is obviously aimed at Christians, but is it also aimed at a wider audience?
So the aim of the research project, Christian Ethics of Farm Animal Welfare, is to try and find an approach to farmed animal welfare that is particularly engaged with Christian concerns. So secular animals groups have been trying to work on farm animal welfare in all kinds of ways for a while, but we think there's a gap in how far groups have been successful in making specifically Christian arguments, connecting Christian faith commitments with concern for farmed animals. And so that's the key primary audience for our project. We hope churches at all levels and other Christian organizations will pick up the report, find it a really useful way to say, well, here's some ideas for how we could think about how our organization could take account of farmed animal welfare in what we do. But if the report is of wider interest, to groups beyond that, we'll be very, very glad indeed. We do some useful work, I think, surveying how animals are farmed in the UK and how far, given their species-specific needs, how far they can flourish in farming environments. And we think the analysis we're doing there may be of much wider interest.
I was struck actually in reading the framework. I mean, because you focus on this idea of a flourishing life. And of course, from our perspective, a few years back, Laudato Si was published by Pope Francis, and he talks about our relationship to the creation, which seems to stretch things beyond the kind of traditional animal welfare perspectives, and particularly the anthropocentric nature of those perspectives. Was that something which you had in mind as a group when you were talking about these flourishing lives?
So I certainly was really excited when I first read Laudato Si when it was published 5 years ago. And the idea of connecting up human, environmental and animal well-being, and this vision of an integral ecology that Pope Francis wrote about in Laudato Si, I find really exciting. And flourishing is a great term, I think, because it helps to link the ways in which, it's botanical originally as a metaphor, that plants flower and flourish. But then it's also a term that can relate to animal well-being and human well-being. And so I think it's a really helpful way of gathering together concern for humans, concern for animals, and concern for the environment. And to recognize that if Christians believe in a God who is the God of all of these creatures and the whole of creation, we've got good reason in our scriptures and beyond to believe that God's concerned about the ability of every creature to flourish. And farmed animals are among those creatures. And so thinking about whether and how farm animals can flourish seems to us a really helpful way to frame this in a Christian context. So it's got links obviously to other perspectives in animal ethics. Aristotelian ethics focuses on this idea of flourishing as well, and so that's got links to other accounts beyond the Christian.
I must admit, I like the use of the term flourishing because it has that idea of growth and development, and actually a kind of natural feel to it in terms of that view of life, which I thought was quite nice. I'd like to bring in Chris Fegan now, who's our chief executive. Chris, CCA have been working on a fish project, the Eurogroup for Animals. How do you feel the framework fits in with the kind of things we've been concerned about on that fish project?
Well, firstly, can I say that I'm delighted with the project, and now that the framework has been published, and indeed Catholic Concern for Animals have been involved with the project since pretty much day one, because David asked us as CCA, and indeed the Catholic Church in the UK, as well as many other Christian stakeholders, would we support the project? And I was delighted to say yes, we would. So clearly, it's a thing that's very important to CCA farmed animals in the UK and, of course, elsewhere. So we were delighted with the project. I'm delighted with the framework, and in particular, what I would say is, in answer to your question, Gerald, is that I'm delighted there's a big section on fish, and David knows because I sat on the project reference group, and I repeatedly just kept pressing about that we were going to cover fish. We are going to cover fish, aren't we? We are looking at fish, aren't we? And I'm delighted that we have, and David and his team have done so. And there's a big section on aquaculture and fish farming in the UK, because from our perspective in CCA, and we're not alone in this view, that fish are in many ways a forgotten species. People always talk about land animals, quite rightly so, about the way animals are treated in the farmed environment. But fish are often forgotten. And of course, there's more fish on the planet than anything else. 71% of the world is ocean, of the planet, although we're talking obviously of farming here rather than wild fishery. So I'm delighted at that. Just a little point as we are recording this at this time. The papers and the media seem focused at the very last minute of the Brexit transition period on the possibility of a deal between the UK and the European Union failing on the matters of fishing. On the one, practically everything else allegedly is sorted out apart from fishing. And the one thing that strikes me, without making any view on the debate on one side or the other of the UK or the EU's position, is that the fish don't get a look in. They're just traded as a commodity. No one's interested in actual the fish. It's just they're just a trade, and the rights to catch them. Not any discussion at all by anybody about the actual fish. And as has been mentioned many times, fish are caught. The only creatures that we talk about as tonnage rather than individuals. So it's very striking at this moment we're having this discussion, while just before the end of the year, when the Brexit transition period finishes, and fishing seems to be the final sticking point, but those fish themselves don't get discussed.
Yeah, one of the things that within the framework, which I must admit I had not considered before, which is a bit stupid, was that in fact within that tonnage we actually don't know how many individuals are being farmed. I mean, it differs with species because their weights when they are harvested, and that in itself is an interesting term with respect to living creatures, when they are harvested varies from species to species. But I think it was rainbow trout was mentioned in the framework. You can't work out how many individuals are involved because the body weight of these individuals differs so dramatically once at the time of harvesting, and so we simply have no idea how many fish we're farming as individuals, or indeed how many fish we're catching wild, which is what's the matter of interest with Brexit at the moment. And of course,
the figures in the trillions regarding the
fish. Absolutely.
And the point I would make is that, and David might have a view on this better than I, when you talk about individuals, they have a focus, and you'll recall the furore some years ago when a particular lion that was named Cecil was shot by a crossbow by an American trophy hunter, and the crisis around they identified Cecil the lion, and that became as that individual's life had been taken. And here we're talking trillions of fish that no one seems particularly to care about.
Yeah, and in the UK context, it is quite hard to count how many fish are being farmed. But one figure that the Farm Animal Welfare Committee came up with in 2014 was, in a year, perhaps 180 million salmon eggs are laid down. And then there's mortality, quite high mortality rates, between laying down eggs and, fish being sort of transferred to sea cages. But that gives you a sort of sense of the scale of the operation in the UK. It's not as many it's not as many fish that we kill each year as chickens, which is quite striking. But it's the second most numerous animal that we kill for food in the UK, through farming.
I think that's another fact, because I mean, I think a lot of people would not be aware that we are actually a very big fish farming nation. I think it's something like second biggest in Europe, and that, to a large extent, is hidden. I mean, people see sheep and cattle as they go around. You don't see fish farms unless you happen to be in the area where they are, I think it's also very difficult to, I mean, Chris was going about Cecil the lion. I mean, it's very difficult to anthropomorphize fish because they are so different from us. Mm-hmm. Is that something which we need to get over in terms of dealing with these kind of species?
Yeah, I think one of the first things we need to think about as we're approaching, concern for the welfare of farmed fish is to recognize that there is this huge obstacle to getting people to engage with the well-being of fish. And as I've been researching this myself, I've been really struck that we've recognized that there is this difference for millennia. So in a dialogue published by Plutarch, this ancient Roman philosopher, there's a dialogue about whether or not we ought to care about fish. And one character in the dialogue says, well, fish are alien to us. They live in this completely alien environment. Unlike birds and mammals, they're in this alien environment. We can't read from their facial expressions how they're feeling, and we can't hear their voices. And so I think those three, 2,000 years later, those three features that differentiate fish from mammals and to some extent from birds are really striking. We feel distant from them in the way we don't in relation to mammals and birds. And that means we've got to work harder to develop an empathetic connection with the well-being of fish. And for me, that's a challenge in learning more. We need to learn more about the capacities of fish, the way, their cognitive abilities, their memory, their patterns of life. And for me, that's helped me overcome that barrier and recognize that no, these are sentient beings. That's been a matter of debate. These are beings which can feel pain. I had a colleague, Lynn Snedden, former colleague at University of Chester, who did some pioneering research on pain in fish. But not just are they sentient or can feel pain, but they've got this astonishing social intelligence. They've got this astonishing repertoire of sort of cognitive abilities, which means that we can begin to recognize commonalities even across this broad divide.
And I think that's again, I mean, one of the interesting things that the oceans, the water environment, is something which generally we know so little about. I mean, I think people talk about us knowing more about the surface of the moon than we know about the surface of the oceans and of the seas, I should say. I think that because fish inhabit that world, they're even more alien to us than creatures like dolphins and whales, who have mammalian aspects to them which we can relate. And the life cycle of fishes is so strange as well, the way they develop over time, and that has relevance as well to the way in which they're treated in aquaculture, which the framework talks about.
That's right, and it's one of the striking things is how strange and different it is to be farming, say, a migratory species of fish such as salmon, than it is to be farming other animals in the UK. And so if you take a fish which has this astonishing physiological change from freshwater to saltwater to accommodate this remarkable life cycle of kind of making their way down freshwater rivers, streams and rivers into the ocean and then back and able to thrive, you know, across these migrations of hundreds of miles. And then you subject those animals to very confined tanks or sea cages with very high stocking densities and no attention at all to environmental enrichment, unlike, you know, any other species of farmed animal. It's really remarkable, the extremity of what we're doing to these particular animals. And I mean, I was astonished when, even just as we have been involved in this CEFAW research, to realize these are animals that are not protected under farmed animal welfare regulations at all. There's no protections there. They are included under responsibilities under the Animal Welfare Act. But I've recently discovered that there's been no prosecutions ever of any fish farming in the UK under the Animal Welfare Act. So how good can the policing be of this activity if we've got no evidence at all of any enforcement actions?
Yeah, I mean, that's recently changed, hasn't it, with the European Union legislation, where fish have begun to come in, but they were specifically excluded from some aspects of EU legislation in the past, which is interesting. Be interesting to see how we do outside of the European Union on this regard. But you yourself have published the second volume of your own research on animals, and I just wonder if you could talk to us a bit about how fish.
There we go.
Thanks for the plug, Chris.
I wonder if you just talk to us from about how fish fit in with your research and your view on our relationship to animals.
Yeah, so in that work, I was really concerned when I got so On Animals Volume 2 talks about how we're using animals in all kinds of different ways, but the biggest chapter is about our use of animals for food. And I wanted to start with fish, and it seemed obvious that I should, as soon as I realized that sort of 98 to 99% by number of all the animals that we consumed globally are fish. So it seems like it's an obvious reason for priority concern for fish. And then once we begin to recognize the fish as sentient creatures, then suddenly they sort of come onto our radar as being consumed in these vast numbers, and then with very, very little regard for their well-being. And so if we think beyond the farmed environment to wild capture fisheries, it's about 50-50 globally at the moment. There's been huge increase in aquaculture. But about half of our fish now come from wild capture fisheries and about half from farmed environments. And both give us really serious reasons for concern about fish welfare. With the wild capture fisheries, it's about massive reductions in fish stocks. Perhaps 90% of the fish in the target species of fish that we farmed in the 20th century were sort of fished out of the ocean. So we reduced fish stocks by 90% in that 100-year period, which is just a remarkable sort of devastation of ocean habitat. But also, if we begin to think of these as sentient creatures, the slaughter process, which involves being trapped in gill nets or being compressed in other kinds of nets, being sort of drawn out of the ocean, which would kill or maim large quantities of fish, and then being dumped on the decks of fishing vessels and being left slowly to asphyxiate in a process that could take hours and is slowed down by refrigeration on those vessels. These are animals that we're not even bothering to slaughter in the wild capture context. And I really think we need to bring the plight of these creatures onto our ethical radar and realize that this is something that many animal ethicists even have just completely overlooked in terms of the impacts on these creatures.
Within
there, sorry,
Chris.
Come in there to say that I was delighted to plug the book. The simple reason, David, it's one of the few theological ethics books that actually address the issue of fish in some detail. And I think in that respect, your book is groundbreaking. So I was delighted to plug it because I said, perhaps I'm doing somebody a disservice, but in lots of the literature I've seen, fish are, again, this expression of forgotten species. And certainly overfishing in the wild fishing context is one of the major problems. And again, without wishing to go on too much about these issues, we're having these negotiations about the rights of fishing. But you know, in an area like Cornwall, which is one of the key fishing communities of the UK, you know, in the early part of the last century, you know, they just completely outfished some of the stocks, and there was complete economic meltdown because we were, you know, the amounts of herring, stroke mackerel that were there in the sea was enormous, and we just, over a small period, just decimated it to practically zero. So it's not perhaps you know, who has the rights to catch what and where. It's how many you should be catching, and the quota system, frankly, has been less than successful. And as you rightly say, you know, the issues regarding slaughter because it's all down, I think, to this fish being a forgotten species and ignored, as some points Gerald made about them being an other type of creature.
One of the strange things in all this is that one would have thought that fish would have been a matter of particular interest for Christians, given the iconic nature of them in the religion, if nothing else. I mean, do you think Christians ought to have a real interest in fish with their faith background?
I do, but I think there are challenges there as well. So I think we need to reckon seriously with the fact that the ancient world shared this sense of fish as a completely different kind of creature from mammals and birds. So, for example, when Christian monasteries were sort of putting in food rules, there were rules about mammals and poultry, but fish were an entirely different category. In some of the sects that were sort of strictly vegetarian in Jesus's own time, it was still permitted to eat fish. People were given sort of different kinds of reasons for why they might have been thought about in such different categorical terms. So there's partly this sort of sense of them being sort of alien and, you know, us not being able to read their faces or hear their voices. But in the context of early Christianity, there's also the sense that fish weren't part of the sacrificial system, so that they weren't sort of bound up with kind of religious observance, meat being offered to idols in the same way that other meat was. But also, I think there was a sense that whereas farmed animals were sort of under human power and under sort of human control, when you went to get fish, it was like you were sort of being supplied graciously by God with this sort of almost, you know, the sense in the Gospels of a miraculous catch. I think that sort of applied more broadly. This felt like you were sort of receiving from a sort of an abundant God rather than sort of breeding and doing sort of something under your power. And I think that had an influence on thinking differently about fish as well. So I think we do have you know, reasons for thinking differently about fish, and there's, you know, the stories of Jesus eating fish in the New Testament, whereas there's not stories, and cooking fish and serving fish, but there's not stories of him eating any other kind of animal, which is interesting. And so there is this kind of additional Christian question for fish. But then, you know, as I've been discovering in research recently, there's also lots of Christian identification with fish. So thinking about the sort of Christian soul as kind of in a big ocean and needing rescuing, sometimes in the form of a net, which is, you know, a bit ambiguous. But also then, you know, stories of the saints like St. Anthony, who was one of St. Francis's monks. He goes and preaches to the fish in Rimini. When people in Rimini won't listen to him, he goes and preaches to the fish instead, and he preaches a fish-specific sermon about how they must be the most graced creatures, because while all the other animals were subject to, you know, punishment in the flood, the fish, you know, of course, aren't punished in that kind of way. And so I think there are resources for thinking Christianly about fish. And then I'm really keen on Christians taking contemporary science regularly. I think Christian theologians have always taken, contemporary science seriously. Thomas Aquinas was, engaging with the best science of his day. And if we engage with the best science of our day in terms of understanding the lives of these creatures, that means that we need to rethink this categorical difference that people with have been sort of comfortable with, and realize that we need to take fish out of that category. And if we're concerned about the flourishing of God's creatures, we need to be concerned about in what environments fish get to flourish too.
Chris, is there anything you want to add at this stage?
Yeah, I think on that, it's an important issue about diet and the Christian traditional difference between fish and other creatures. And obviously, without getting into a debate, which is possibly for another day, on the issues of what did Jesus eat himself, and which obviously is certainly bound into this discussion when you have it with Christians about diet. From our perspective, CCAs, we don't really see a difference between fish and other creatures, and obviously, there is this debate to be had with regarding some Christians seeing fish as different, and one of the issues at the moment, because we're in Advent, is the issue of fasting, and that in some parts of the world, they're now fasting from meat, but allowed to eat fish. And that's happening right now. And we're having discussions with colleagues about that and talking about that issue. Hopefully with colleagues in Central and Eastern Europe, where it's quite a big tradition from, and it has come from the Christian tradition in the Middle Ages, but they still do it to this day, where it's acceptable. So, you want to adhere to your religion, so you adhere to the fast, but you're eating, in this case, carp, for example. So there's a very big issue about diet in the Christian tradition, and I think as David has said, it goes right back to in some ways, obviously before Christ, but obviously the life of Christ as well for Christians is obviously extremely critical. So yes, so from our perspective, which may or may not be shared by others, I don't see a difference between the fish on one hand and land-based animals on the other in terms of diet. And anything else that might actually.
I think it's interesting the way that fish have become regarded in Christian society in terms of their alienness and the fact that we don't regard them the way we do other farmed animals. But one of the things which I think is interesting about the whole debate around fish, the sentient nature and the way in which it's arisen, is that one of the things that people don't discuss is the role of animals, of creatures, whatever we're talking about, within the wider ecology, within creation itself. And fish play an enormous role in terms of the food chain in the oceans, in terms of the way in which the seas and the oceans operate. Do you think that we need to pay more attention to the way in which all creatures, but fish in particular in this instance, actually contribute to the wider environment, their local and their global ecologies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to preserve this sense of a concern about each creature individually as a creature of God, but recognize that the whole project of the created order works insofar as each creature plays, their own particular role. And Psalms like Psalm 104, these great creation theologies suggest that we have a Christian theology that recognizes the place of every creature in God's purposes, and each creature doing its creaturely thing in glory and glorifying their creator through their flourishing. And so fish, I think we need to recognize as sort of one part of that. And to go back to the wild capture fisheries again for a moment, that makes it particularly scandalous for us to use ways of capturing fish that don't discriminate and so there are some fishing modes where you're sort of teams of ships are dragging nets that are kilometers wide with heavy booms that are dragging along the bed of the ocean, and they're basically doing oceanic clear cutting. So they're taking everything in their path. Everything gets sort of caught up, and it does astonishing damage to the seabed and to lots of non-target species. Dolphin-friendly tuna is kind of one example of this, but there are seabirds and there are seals, and all kinds of creatures just get sort of caught up in this awful non-discriminatory sort of capture process. And so, yes, we need to be much more concerned about our oceanic environments. We need more spaces where fishing is not allowed, and to allow these complex ecosystems to develop. Otherwise, we're going to find our oceans empty. There was one report a couple of years ago that says if we carry on our current trajectory, there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish by 2050.
Yeah, I could just add something again, Gerald, and this is something that occurs to me, but is not often discussed, and perhaps you may have a view on it. Is that going back to wild capture fisheries? We obviously the image of the wild capture fishery is the boat out at sea, but coming back to this overfishing point, and again going back to the example I gave earlier, certainly the pilchard fishery in Cornwall, and one of the most productive was St Ives Bay. Well, that was like an early type of industrialized farming, actually, because it was something from the foreshore with huge net, and it was it was like a huge industrialized farming, although it was in the sea, and they just wiped out the whole stock in a matter of decades, to be kind. And of course, then that affected the whole economy of the region, because it had been based on that, and then there was nothing left because we'd completely abused it. So there is, when we talk about industrialized farming, we don't often look at fish in that way, but that's perhaps, maybe I'm stretching a point, but perhaps an example of one of the earliest types of what was could I argue, industrialized farming method.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up, gentlemen. But I don't know whether either of you have any last comments you'd like to make. Chris, do you want to say anything?
I'll go first, and then David can finish. I'll just firstly say thank you again very much, David, for taking the time to do this and be the first person we've interviewed for this this series.
Absolutely.
Really pleased, and obviously on the back of the launch of the document recently, it's very good timing in that respect. And I hope we have many more of these, and I'm delighted that it's on fish, which is, again, to use the thing I'm using a lot, is the forgotten species.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me.
Well, it's been a pleasure, David. I mean, I'd love to carry on this, but unfortunately, time won't allow us. And I would like to add my own personal thanks for you coming along. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and hope to see you again in the not too distant future. Thank you.